Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with Van Gosse, and we're going to get into Van's work. It's quite extensive and cover a lot of different topics. First off, Van, thanks so much for joining us. I was hoping that you could introduce yourself and include in your introduction some of your political background, which I should note spans the anti-Vietnam War movement, George McGovern's 1972 campaign, the El Salvador Solidarity movement that began in the 1980s. There's a lot of stuff.
Well, this is the advantage of getting older, right? So I was born in 1957, grew up in a college town in Pennsylvania. My parents were academics. They were very, very liberal. They were against the war from as long as I can remember, which when you're a 7-year-old boy, you sort of assume the U.S. is always in the right and always wins. And I remember being like, how could that be? How could this be a bad idea? But it grew on me. And so I was just old enough to get into the anti-war movement at a very, it was all around me. And then we moved to New York, or my mom moved to New York in 1969. And it was really just a completely pervasive presence in 1969, 1970. I remember when Kent State happened, things like that. About as mass a movement as you can imagine. And the only thing I've seen like that is Black Lives Matter, and in some ways maybe No Kings. But this wasn't just periodic. This was just ongoing, like all the time. And I'm a kid, realistically 12, 13, 14. But I was 14 when the things began to wind down. So you're just sort of along, not naively, but just fully in it. So there was that, and I began volunteering for progressive electoral stuff. We're talking when I'm 12, 13, 14, 15. A lot of licking envelopes and being sent out to distribute leaflets. But that gradually got a little more serious. And in 1975, 1976, I worked on ex-Senator Fred Harris's presidential campaign. That was when there was still a lot of left-wing hopes, and he was a very impressive person. Very few people would know who he was now, but he had been a leading Democratic senator from Oklahoma, very progressive from Oklahoma. And he was the furthest left of the 11 serious Democratic candidates in 1976. So that was something. And then, a lot of, I'm not going to, personal biography's not that interesting. I did get involved in the El Salvador movement, especially the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador in 1982, while I was a student at Columbia University, an old student. And I worked in that movement for the next 13 years. And then a whole lot of other stuff happened. I was very involved in helping set up United for Peace and Justice in 2002, 2003, and for the rest of its sort of large-scale operations, the anti-Iraq War Coalition. And now I'm doing all kinds of other stuff too. And I'm an historian, and I co-chair Historians for Peace and Democracy. You can look us up. We've been very active lately, especially around Palestine.
Very briefly, how did Historians for Peace and Democracy come about?
In 2002, I really remember being out of the country at that point. By that point, I was an assistant professor, an old assistant professor at Franklin and Marshall College. And if you went over to Europe then, it was absolutely clear that the U.S. was going to go to war with Iraq. It was talked about very directly. In the U.S., it was this sort of, you got a sense of the timidity of the press in the U.S. They couldn't quite come out and say what the rest of the world knew. And we're talking in the spring of 2002. It was that clear. I had been very involved in sort of peace and anti-war politics. I'd been the organizing director of Peace Action from 1995 to 2000, so I knew a lot of people. Well, I know a lot of the same people now. We're all older. And, we started talking to each other, and I talked to and said, we have to really do something serious and broad-based. And, I don't want to pull my punches. A lot of people at the time thought this. We can't let the Answer Coalition and the Workers' World Party dominate this, because they will never build a movement anywhere near big enough or broad enough to actually do something. And that sounds a little sectarian, but, we've been dealing with them for many years, and, they have their politics. So actually, I'm looking at a friend of mine, Jeremy Varon, Varon, just published a book, Our Grief is Not a Cry for War, The Movement to Stop the War on Terror. And it's all of that. The founding of United for Peace and Justice, in which I was involved, and things like that. It's all in his book. So Jeremy Varon, Our Grief is Not a Cry for War. So in terms of Historians for Peace and Democracy was founded as Historians Against the War. And at really the same time, the fall, September, October, November of 2002, when the authorization to use military force is being voted. I note that a very large majority of House Democrats did not vote for that. I have to say this because so many, even historians, seem to have this idea that there was unanimous support or almost unanimous support for the war in Iraq. Not true at all. That's how Nancy Pelosi became Speaker, because her own caucus said we can't have the person who was the head of the Democratic Party in the House gone with the war. So had been by that point already very involved in the Radical History Review, very well-established magazine and sort of community in our profession. And I talked to someone that I knew, Andor Scottness, and we just sort of thought we need to form a group of historians. So in the American Historical Association annual meeting, January 2003, we called a meeting. More than 80 people came, just handing out leaflets. One of the most distinguished historians in the country, David Montgomery, sat down, great working class historian at Yale, sat down and wrote a 3 or 4 sentence statement. We're against this war. And we took off, very rapidly. I mean, within less than a year, we had a couple of thousand people on our mailing list. So that's a continuous history. And it was after Trump's election that we changed our name to Historians for Peace and Democracy, because clearly there was more than just the wars, which under Obama had, frankly, to at least meaningful extent, wound down. So we were already broadening our message. So we've been around it'll be 23 years in January.
I was first introduced to your work through your 2021 book, The First Reconstruction, Black Politics in America from the Revolution to the Civil War. And then following your name on the internet, I discovered your work with Historians for Democracy and Peace, and then also your writings on the New Left and other social and political movements in the U.S. Before turning to your work around the New Left, I thought we could start with the First Reconstruction. And
Sure.
I was curious what motivated this book.
There's a pattern in my scholarship going all the way back of I start at one place and end up someplace very different. That's true of my first book, Where the Boys Are, Cuba, Cold War America, and the Making of a New Left, more than 30 years ago. I started out doing something completely different. And basically the same process has happened more than once, where I think, well, there's a little something before this, and I better make sure I know what it is. So if you asked about the First Reconstruction, I had a very well-established plan and a huge amount of research for a book that realistically I may never write. It was going to be called Black Power in White America. And I was researching and planning this in the late 90s into early 2000s. Black Power in White America, I forget what the subtitle was, and it was going to go from the end of Reconstruction, let's say 1877 approximately, through at that point the present, meaning like the Clinton years. And when I was doing this book, I kept finding very, very stray references, like one article from 1917, here and there little bits about, there were a few black men voting and somewhere maybe a black man got elected to office. And I had this, as in the past, I better make sure I know about that. Well, it took a long time because I couldn't rely on other people's scholarship. There was a tremendous amount of excellent scholarship in sort of the social, cultural movement, every kind of history dealing with Black Americans, both enslaved and free, but virtually nothing about actual engagement in politics, because I think most people assumed, and indeed, I mean, some of the people who'd written that great history, I'm thinking of Gary Nash, for instance, became a very important advisor for me. He would read my stuff and he said, I just didn't know there was any. I didn't get to that. I'm glad you are. So that's what happened. But it ended up being a labor of love that took me about 14 years, to do, just going back. And it's a very long book. Let's be clear. It's a goddamn doorstop, but that's because nobody else had written about this, or at least very much. So I felt like I had to do the whole thing, get it down on the record that there had been very extensive Black engagement in regular U.S. electoral politics from even in some places the 1790s on. And I'll say one more thing is almost all the references would be to how they were disfranchised. The textbooks might even have Maryland 1803 and New Jersey 1807 and New York 1821 and so on. And they all seem to assume that this disfranchisement had no real meaning, that it was, I think the implied assumption is that free black men were disfranchised in all these states where they had voted simply as a sort of like gesture of racism. And my argument was, no, they were disfranchised because there were a significant number of them voting. And, it was at a certain point, it became like just like now, like, oh, let's get rid of those people. They're not real Americans. Like I said, just like now. So I felt I had to like go back and find all of this. And it turned out it was there in the record, a huge record of black men's engagement in politics in places like New York City, Boston, Portland, Maine, New Bedford, Massachusetts, and so on and so on.
One of the things that I appreciate about your book is that it carves out or helps the reader, who is not an historian in my case, understand, just as you were saying, where your work fits in the rest of the history. And so you write, for example, that, and this is your quote, inserting black politics into the existing history has unsettling implications for how we understand post-revolutionary American politics. And you build on that, recognizing black voters disrupts a narrative of the early republic as a democracy with black people on the margins. And actually, as I was reading that, I glanced over to my bookshelf where I had just purchased a copy of The Rise of American Democracy, which is a book that you mentioned in that regard. And then you say it also disrupts a narrative of the early republic as completely organized around slavery, with white republicanism as an accomplished fact.
I mean, this is what happens as a historiography grows up, as people get further and further away. And this could be true of, I don't know, the New Deal or World War I. I don't know, you pick some, or the Civil War, right? That gradually certain things become what we all know and the way it was and the way it had to be. And the contingency, the, not absolutely foreseen and necessary and inevitable quality of things, the contingency, the other possibilities become clearer. So actually, I'm going to give an example that isn't from my work, but is a very, really key. Until not that long ago, certainly through the 70s, 80s, in some cases longer, all the leading American historians would assert, or white historians, to be clear, because there are always black historians who were way ahead. Really way ahead on this front. Like even now, I'm writing things where it's like, they were already there where you're trying to get to. And I'm not kidding. Carter Woodson, W.E.B. Du Bois, so many figures. But leading white historians would say, as a matter of fact, settled, that the system of slavery was not really an issue during and after the Revolution, or was a minor issue. It was accepted as natural, as an historical fact, and that opposition to it grew up only much later. That would have been asserted. And I'm blanking on the name. One of these these are not shabby people. These are serious people. One of them, and I'm blanking on his name, wrote an article, a very important article in the American Historical Review, asserting that this was not someone hostile to the importance of slavery. He just thought this was the case. And 20 or 30 years later, sorry, I'm blanking on the guy's name, he recanted. He said, I was wrong. It was a really central fact. It was very contested. You have to dig in and find that. So this is an example of what I mean. So from my work, departing from the fact that slavery was never natural or accepted, that it took a great deal of work by slaveholders using their political power consistently in radical and dramatic ways to insist on how it could not be challenged. But their very insistence from the Missouri Compromise on is what ultimately brought into being the Republican Party and the end of slavery. So it's hard fought all the way through. Okay, so back to my work. Well, there's two things I'm going to say that will get at this. When the Dred Scott decision came down, right afterwards, Abraham Lincoln, I actually got this straight from Foner. It was in one of his books, but I would have found it anyway, I hope. Abraham Lincoln, gets up in Springfield. He's already a rising, very important, people are paying attention to him. And he says, quoting Justice Benjamin Curtis's dissent in the Dred Scott decision. And he said, and everybody knows this, that in 5 of the original 13 states, free black men voted. And Lincoln, it's in my book, it's in Foner, he says, that means they voted on the ratification of the Constitution, which makes them founders of this country. So how can you possibly accept this absurd decision Dred Scott saying that they never have been citizens. He said the facts contradict this, quoting Justice. So that's there in 1857. And Lincoln was a very good lawyer. This wasn't making something up out of whole cloth. Here's the kicker. Curtis didn't have access to online searches like someone like I do. It wasn't 5 of the 13, it was 10 of the 13. If 10 of the original 13 states did not have a racial suffrage, that tells us that republicanism, this grab bag, all-purpose sort of ideology of popular government, popular representation, was not yet fully racialized. And when you look at where it was, it's Virginia, which has got the lion's share of enslaved people. We try not to say slaves because it makes it sound too natural. We say enslaved people because that's what they were. And South Carolina and Georgia, the Deep South. In South Carolina, it's a majority of enslaved people. Everywhere else, some black men were voting. And it took a long time to drive them out. So republicanism was not hard-baked in as white. It took a lot of work to make it that. And and this is a historiographical point, meaning there's an essay by a great historian, again, like Gary Nash, someone who schooled me a lot, James Brewer Stewart. James Brewer Stewart's book on abolition, the anti-slavery movement, I read it when I was 19. It's called Holy Warriors. I would recommend it today over any other book. James Brewer Stewart, Holy Warriors. It is one of those books that just like you get it, it's all there. So I got to know Jim Stewart. He died only recently, later on. And I read all his work. And he has a brilliant article, I can't remember the title, where he argues very convincingly, and many of us were influenced by this, that what we think of as the full-on racialism, not racism, but racialism, thinking racially, seeing race as a fixed category, always noticing what someone is and isn't, and could someone be black, meaning, frankly, barely colored, black, right? He pointed out that that's really a later development. That comes in with the Jacksonian Democrats. It's part of the founding of the Democratic Party in the 1820s. That prior to then, there were much less clear understandings of what race or color was. And in that, I write about this extensively in there. And, in some cases, I go back to very old scholarship. Winthrop Jordan's White Over Black is a brilliant piece of work that explicates that in the 17th and 18th and into the 19th centuries, what we think of as race was a lot less fixed, and it's much less of a dogma for anybody. So that's a lot of where I'm coming from on that to see whiteness as a process, a making whiteness. There's probably a book with that title, not as something that was always there. And here, just because I'm sitting in my hometown in Pennsylvania, and I just mentioned it to someone the other day, I was making a joke. There's this word swarthy that gets used about. I just saw a play in New York about the Kardashians. Allow me to digress. It's called Meet the Kardashians. It's about the Kardashians. And in the play, one of the Armenian characters talks very directly about what Kim Kardashian does, that she plays between white and black with her skin tanners, all this stuff. And then the word swarthy comes up. Colorism, right? Think about Armenians. Pardon me if I digress. So I was making a joke to someone about swarthy, and they said, oh, that word, what does that imply? My digression leads towards Ben Franklin in 1761, and this is a famous quotation. Ben Franklin in 1761 in Pennsylvania, talking about, and I quote, the swarthy Germans are certainly not white. Now, Ben Franklin was not exactly a minor figure even in 1761, because the Germans were dark, I don't mean they're like African people, but they were black-haired, black-browed, and, he thought white meant fair-haired people from the British Isles. I hope my little story here clarifies what I'm getting at. Race, it took a long time to lock it in, and that created a lot of space for men who were of African descent to participate in politics.
There are 2 books that are coming to mind. One is The Strange Career of Jim Crow.
Oh, yeah.
By C. Van Woodward.
Oh, my gosh.
It seems that book does a little bit of what you're trying to do, or what you do successfully, but perhaps after not perhaps, obviously after the Civil War, after the traditional stoppage point of Reconstruction, and saying, look, segregation wasn't fully developed into this thing until later than we think.
Yeah, right. And it's really great that you brought up that book, which was Woodward was making a political intervention. It came out roughly coterminous with Brown v. Board of Education. He wanted to denaturalize the Jim Crow system, which Southern white people, he was one after all. At that point, you're 60, 70 years in. tried to insist is just our way of life, just the way it's always been down here, And he said, well, no, actually, it's relative. It's a lot more recent, and it took a lot more work to make this happen, to construct this thing. So it's an excellent comparison. That's why I ended up calling the book The First Reconstruction, which is a controversial title. It's not the title that I had actually for most of the writing. I mean, in my scholarship, it puts a lot of emphasis on the decisions that people make, on the political processes and other social, cultural processes in which they're embedded and where choices have to be made and people bounce off each other. But in the book in First Reconstruction, it's actually focused on what were then considered major cities, meaning places of, 12 or 14,000 people where they all know each other, and the choices they make there, whether to allow someone to vote or whether to chase a slave catcher out of town and beat him first, to put it bluntly. Chase him out of town and beat him first so he doesn't come back. I'm being jocular, but there's a lot of that. Very personal. I mean, it's a given. This isn't my scholarship. But if you really want to, what makes the Republican Party unwilling to confront the South militarily, which is what it is, it's seeing all these slave catchers come north after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act and saying, well, wait a minute, that person's my neighbor. You can't just grab him off the street. And all I need to do is say that. And we're talking about right now. And in fact, only on the 18th of October, I heard Governor Pritzker in Illinois at the No Kings rally directly compare what is happening now to the reaction in the North against the Fugitive Slave Act. These people are my neighbors, I'm not going to let some goons come in and kidnap them. And I mean, it also helps us understand why John Brown was actually a popular hero. I mean, if you want to know why the South why they went for war, it was seeing the reaction to what happened when the state of Virginia hanged him. Most of the biggest Protestant churches in at least large parts of the North put out black bunting. This is what civil war looks like, people arriving at completely opposing viewpoints.
I wanted to continue asking you a little bit about the historiography of this period that you note. And you write that since the 70s, and for good reason, old-style political history, focusing narrowly on the evolution of parties, elections, voting, and what the state does, has been pushed aside in favor of social history, the narratives of families, communities, races, ethnicities, classes, and genders, and the social movements stemming from those identities and locations. And you conclude, the meaning of politics has expanded in every direction. Can you lay out this change for us and explore what's been the impact of focusing less on the actual arrangements of power, as you put it, but both within this study of antebellum Black politics, but perhaps more generally?
So I'm a product of the Rutgers New Brunswick Ph.D. program, 85 to 91 or so. And when I got there, it was ground zero for social history in the United States, and especially women's and gender history. And I benefited tremendously by being in that program. Cutting edge scholars, extremely egalitarian. So I have the opposite of regrets. I'm so glad I went there, Rutgers, and I'm still very loyal to that department. But having said that, it is safe to say that for most of the people that I knew, and there was, you go to grad school, you have this sort of hardcore of the people around you, a couple of dozen, whatever. To a very large extent, the traditional, if you want to call it, political history was kind of an add-on. Like you didn't want to, you didn't want to make a really dumb mistake, like not know when someone was elected president, though, you needed to have enough knowledge of that to pass your comprehensive exams. But all of the focus was, and as I said, for good reason, on the deep, dense social history that had been developing since the 1960s. And, when I say for good reason, because until then, almost all of the history was the history of men of power and the institutions in which they operated. Presidential administrations, parties, prime ministers, parliamentary politics, wars, diplomacy. That is most of what it was. And I remember when I wanted to this is another anecdote. So when I decided to go to grad school, somewhere around, when would that have been? Maybe early 1984. So I went back to my undergraduate department, which was Columbia, and I'd been very happy. And I talked to the head of the department. I will not name him, but he knew me very well. He'd actually given me a prize. And I said, well, I want to study. I think I probably said something like, I want to study all this new stuff and I'm interested in. He said, oh, he named someone, a young woman. He said, we've got, and I'm not going to say her name, she would be well known. We've got so-and-so. She's doing all of that. And I don't mean to make fun, but he really, like, they had one person who was doing social, women's, cultural history, all of this, which is what was really taking off then. And that was, and I say this in Columbia, was, believe me, by no means the most old style department. There were ones that were very hostile to this new history, especially, to be clear, women's history. My ending up writing something that is kind of like old style political history, but with a very different focus, with a focus on people who had formerly been completely excluded, I would say that was a sort of challenge to what I've been trained in. I've been trained in social history, that what mattered is what people, insurgent groups, how they organize themselves, or how communities function. And this wasn't static, but marvelous histories of, oh my goodness, Mary Ryan, the cradle of the middle class, often focused on a particular place. For everyone, always E.B. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class. There was nothing small scale or lacking in ambition, but there was what I've referred to as traditional or old style political history. The arrangements of power kind of moved into the background, I would say. I want to make sure what I'm saying is kind of almost a caricature in some ways. There were always people who were doing all of it. Eric Foner always did all of it. He did political history, but with social and intellectual and cultural all mixed in. It was a complete history. And he was certainly a model, actually, for the way things should be done. So I'm saying I ended up doing a history of Black politics because, in a certain crude sense, everything else had been done. I don't mean I was looking for something. I was interested in politics. And it was like, well, there's all this there's so many good books dealing with these communities in Boston and Philadelphia and New York and all over the place. I'm talking about free Black people, let alone the enslaved. But there's this piece that it just sort of left out. As I said, I wandered into this. It was by accident. But the more I looked at it, the more I found. So I do think, not to beat around the bush, that it is high time that we make sure to pay enough attention to the arrangements of power. Because at a certain point, if you don't, and this has been, social and cultural history has been in the saddle for a very long time now. If you really step outside the arrangements of power, there is the potential for a certain kind of romanticization of being outside, like, well, there's politics and all these things happen. We'll study communities. And that's actually not how, there's, to paraphrase, I forget, it might be Hermann Goering or someone, you can ignore politics, but politics won't ignore you. And that is, to me, very clearly relevant to the world that we inhabit now, where you are either going to engage with the arrangements of power now, or you are going to embrace your marginality and stand outside speaking truth. We can't afford to speak truth to power. We need to actually challenge it. So anyway, that's my way wandering around why I moved away from social history, except to be clear, the kind of cultural and gendered history that I learned at Rutgers fundamentally shaped it. I mean, there is quite a lot of cultural history in the First Reconstruction. There's a lot of reading of texts and discourses and unpacking. What does it mean that Northern newspaper editors love to mock the vernacular dialect racism of Irish immigrants? What's going on there when they keep reprinting stories about Irish immigrants using strange pronunciations of the N-word? I'm not going to get in trouble but there's a lot of this, a lot of like really vicious ethnic mocking. What does that mean? What is some kind of cultural thing going on there? This isn't about elections. So I do that too. Another historian described Black men and women in this period, the antebellum period, as engaging in what he called shadow politics, meaning the internal politics, very separate, away from, because they were excluded. I actually think that's correct about certain places at certain times, but I also think it's quite mistaken. There is no point, even when he's technically a Garrisonian abolitionist, meaning you abstain from actual elections. Frederick Douglass is always deeply involved, and I think I document that in a great deal of detail, that he is always involved in very regular politics, the politics of the Whig and Democratic parties. He's around it. He's commenting. There's a lot of stuff that is, Douglass is an enormous figure. And what I hope I've done, just using him as an example, is to show how deeply political he was at all points.
Well, and what it also does, it occurs to me, because I'm also reading McPherson's The Struggle for Equality.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Great book.
and that book is interesting because it shows abolitionists wrestling with how to engage with the political process.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a question that the left, or those critical of the existing society, have always engaged with. It's as relevant now as ever. One needs to recognize that there was engagement in politics to understand that then there was the wrestling with how do we do that? How do we engage in the
Mm-hmm.
political?
And arguments over it, very serious arguments over it between different groups of abolitionists, black and white, within the black community itself. A substantial number of leading black men, and it is men, at that point, actually supported the Whig Party. You would have to look very hard to find anywhere else but I've documented very precisely. And others supported the Free Soil Party, and others stayed with the Liberty Party, and there's a lot of moving around trying to find advantage.
I wanted to move into the 20th century. Your book, The Movements of the New Left, 1950 to 1975, a brief history with documents. You draw from Paul Potter's 1965 speech, We Must Name the System. Paul Potter was a member of Students for a Democratic Society. And I wanted to read the excerpt. I think it's very powerful. So Potter says, what kind of a system is it that justifies the U.S. or any country seizing the destinies of the Vietnamese people and using them callously for our own purpose? What kind of a system is it that disenfranchises people in the South, leaves millions upon millions of people throughout the country impoverished and excluded from the mainstream and promise of American society, that creates faceless and terrible bureaucracies and makes those the place where people spend their lives and do their work, that consistently puts material values before human values and still persists in calling itself free and still persists in finding itself fit to police the world? And he comes to a conclusion. We must name that system. We must name it, describe it, analyze it, understand it, and change it. And so, obviously, many movements have tried to name that system. and from my perspective, the New Left's democratic demands missed or didn't congeal around the undemocratic political system.
That's a good point.
Really the Constitution. And you're very much aware of how that system works. You introduced me to your 2-part series, Why the U.S. Isn't a True Democracy.
Well, when I read what you wrote, that the New Left did not engage with the, deeply undemocratic nature of our constitutional system, I thought somewhat ruefully, yeah, and I'm sort of a late New Leftist, whatever that means, 1969 on. That's a really, really good point. I think that even though one, certainly could have had sat down and said, well, it's a problem that the Senate is so completely unrepresentative. And it's a problem that the Electoral College is, we don't have a national popular vote. I think there's several things going on. So very recently and extremely helpfully, I've heard it several times just in the past week, a new kind of thesis has come into play. I remember the first time I heard it stated just directly. I think it was Robin Kelly, a great historian, on a webinar that my organization sponsored in March. And Robin said something that was, I'd always understood, but he said it very directly. The U.S. has only been a democracy since 1965. Now, I'd been teaching my students for decades, and I've been, in essence, saying that, but focused on the South, pointing out that it was not until 1968 that the majority of Black Southerners could vote. 1968, and the implication of that. But I probably had never stated as precisely that the U.S. became an actual democracy with the Voting Rights Act and the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. I think that this is the first part of my response. I think that the broadly conceived New Left and post-New Left, whatever you want to call it, was very focused on that. So there's this huge influx of voters and then a steadily building Black representation from, I'm not sure where they got it, but somewhere in 1964 said, well, there's about 100 Black officials, elected officials in the country, which is so statistically small that it would be hard to even represented. I don't know how many there are now. 21,000, 25,000, 30,000, but it rose rapidly at the same time as women who were, again, almost infinitesimally represented in the U.S. political system. People, if you're sitting in the early 60s, people would look around and say, oh, there's that municipal court judge in New York. Literally, most of the women who served in Congress, I'd have to check, but at least a very large number of them had seats that they had taken over from their late husbands. Even the great senator from Maine, Margaret Chase Smith. And she had to take it over a little forcefully. She wasn't just put in there as a placeholder, but she did inherit the seat. First, African Americans, women, and Chicanos, and Puerto Ricans, and LGBTQ people, one after another, and Asian Americans, and Native Americans, all coming into the political system. I think that is what we were all focused on. Either focused on as like fundamentally really important or just aware of. And the deeply undemocratic nature of the system itself, we were less aware of. Just until 2000, when George W. Bush lost the popular vote by 500,000 and got elected anyway. I had been told my entire life that just couldn't happen. That technically it could, and it had back in 1888, but it would never happen again. And if you really sort of put your mind to it, you'd go, watch my mind going, I remember being a little boy and noticing that John F. Kennedy's popular vote margin was 117,000 votes, I believe. Go check. Somebody Google it, right? And the reality is, if you really looked at that, I mean, how many farm workers were loaded on trucks in South Texas? How many people were voted who were in fact deceased in Chicago? Richard Nixon had a really good case for saying, this is pretty dirty. But we lived in this idea of like, well, overall, it's getting better and freer because so many people are coming into the system. But since 2000, things have gone to hell, and suddenly you really become aware of how, Trump in 2016 and oh my God, we could spend all day talking about the attacks on voting rights. It's just been one thing after another. And I'm speaking for myself, but I'm telling you, it certainly reoriented me extremely sharply towards thinking about the system itself and the problem of it. I pay attention to the National Popular Vote Compact. If we can get of course, the Supreme Court could strike it down. If your listeners don't know what that is, National Popular Vote Compact, it's a very sophisticated, totally legal constitutional mechanism that would allow us to have the popular vote elect the president. The Senate, I don't know, but this is what we should be thinking about. So I hope that answers your question. We just weren't thinking about it until it was a wake-up 25 years ago, and then since then it's been hit us like a ton of bricks.
It's very interesting. One, to hear your analysis of that, and especially this idea of an influx of, or an expansion of, people who could vote. And while certainly the universal aspect of suffrage could be critiqued, I think is in many ways incomplete in the U.S., that equal aspect too sits as something unresolved.
To vote in a purely passive way, women had been voting since 1920 and in a lot of states before that, but they had been ignored and entirely left out of the larger system. There were divisions in the parties, and you can say, well, Kennedy appointed the President's Commission on the Status of Women because he knew how much he owed them for his nomination and election and so on. But still, this is very much on the side. Margaret Chase Smith was both very admirable, but also sort of considered probably as a Senator Margaret Chase Smith for decades, the only actual woman senator there ever had been. And I'm just using her as an example, okay, from the 40s through into the 70s. So I'm trying to avoid offensive words, but she also would have been seen as, an exception, to put it politely. So I want to be clear, it's not just voting, it's also being represented. So the Congressional Black Caucus is, that's a huge breakthrough. And now, unfortunately, as I've only really recently discovered, AIPAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, has kind of conquered it by becoming the principal funder of its members, which explains why, from being the, sort of left social democratic wing of Congress for decades, as it was 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, it's declined into impotence. You understand, it's not just voting, it's voting and full participation. And in that context, Reverend Jackson's 2 runs for the presidency were absolutely crucial, and I'm afraid do not receive the attention now that they should.
How do you feel that the people around you, perhaps the folks also involved in Historians for Peace and Democracy, the field of history, do you get the sense that perhaps also people who went through the 60s and the 70s are coming to similar conclusions that you are?
It's not actually the kind of conversation we have in HPAD. That's what we call it, HPAD, because we're dealing with very immediate things like whether our resolutions to the American Historical Association in solidarity with Gosse will go forward or get vetoed again. I mean, there's a lot of we're doing. I don't actually. Who do I have these conversations with? I'm sort of connected to some groups of progressive donors, and so over there I sometimes have them. So, for instance, talking to Dan Cantor, Cantor, who runs the Center for Ballot Freedom. Now, Dan set up the Working Families Party in New York. So he's been involved in actually building left-wing political electoral power since the 90s. So that's where I would have the conversation. The Center for Ballot Freedom is campaigning to gain the legal right for fusion candidacies, which we've had in New York forever. If you grew up in New York, as I did from the end of the 60s on, we're used to multi-party. We're used to multiple, 5, 6 easily, each of some weight. Working Families Party, my votes for Zoran Mondani and everyone else were on their line, not on the Democratic line. But that's because New York State allows fusion candidacies. More than one party can nominate the same person. That's actually the kind of person I would have that conversation with, because fusion would shake things up a lot away from this very rigid duopoly that control the ballot lines and make it harder to get anything done. The Working Families Party as a whole is a recognition, and I take my hat off to everybody who's been involved in that. I'm a very strong supporter of recognition by people on the left that they need to engage with the political system to get inside it. And a lot of people don't realize that working families, they've got I don't know if they would call it a caucus, but they've got a whole group on the city council in Philadelphia, Chicago, state legislatures in places like California. They're really working inside, outside to try to move this quasi now deeply imperiled democracy forward, focusing on these questions of how does this system work and how can we change it.
I wanted to ask, you've written about history across decades, more or less 2 centuries. You've also written about history in different countries. What comes to mind when stepping back and observing the struggles, movements, political movements, along with the more subaltern historical actors?
So under the urging of people close to me, like my daughter, Johanna, who is a very serious scholar herself and a grown person and kind of nudges me along, doesn't let me get too high and full of myself. And she's been saying for quite a while, you really need to get on social media. Now, I think I'm going to hit the 5,000 limit in Facebook. But what difference does it make? Nobody looks at Facebook, right? So not that long ago, I created a Substack, which is called, it's a pun, In the Red. Okay, so Van Gosse, In the Red. I hope you join, Luke. Maybe you already did. And in this Substack and in the Instagram I've attached to it, I'm really trying to get caught up here, not be an altacocker, if I can make a little, culturally appropriated Yiddishism. Anyway, in the Substack, I've described myself as an unreconstructed Jacobin. And what I mean by that is that although I am fully aware of all of the destructive violence and coercion that is not only possible, but very likely in state-centered movements for change, which is what Jacobinism represents, the Jacobin legacy from the French Revolution, which I believe is carried directly into the radical republicanism of people like Thaddeus Stevens. And I think that Fidel Castro, who I've written about and who I think was a very significant and revolutionary leader, a statesman worthy of study, someone who did not go off and get killed as a martyr like Che Guevara, however admirable he was, built a state under very difficult circumstances. So I think Castro was a Jacobin. So, I could play with that language, right? I mean, this was Trotsky's original critique of Lenin, is that he was just a Jacobin. He just wanted to build a party that could drive through the state like an engine and make rapid, sweeping change. So I'm recognizing how risky, terrible things can happen, like a terror. But I don't see any other way. I'm not a horizontalist. In fact, I wouldn't say any of the evidence of the horizontal movements of the past 15 years suggests that that's the way to make change. I think they can have a great effect. I respect. I'm going to avoid specifying, but I think listeners will know what I'm talking about. But you need structures, and structures at a certain point are going to have to be representative. You cannot have a committee of the whole even in one borough of New York, let alone the whole city, let alone this whole country. Share the mic. Share the mic in a country that's the size of a continental empire. So, and I would have no trouble breaking up the U.S. That would be fine. But still, I'm a statist, if you want, when I say I'm a Jacobin, because that's making the U.S. into an actual democracy in 1965 took Lyndon Johnson under tremendous pressure, finally bringing the full weight of the federal government into enfranchising Black people and enforcing their rights. And even then, it took years. That's but I'm not pretending that that's like it's all I've got left, really. I can't think of anything else.
I can't, and I won't, and I don't want to speak for the historian Bruce Levine, who I
I know Bruce.
About his book, Thaddeus Stevens, the Civil War revolutionary fighter for racial justice. That's Bruce's book. I think he shares in some ways a similar background to you, and something that he spoke about was the need for a party, or to interrogate the party question.
Exactly.
So
there you go.
I'm seeing threads around people who I'm just seeing threads.
I don't think anyone would be surprised that I'm a New Yorker voting for Zohran Mamdani on the Working Families Party line in the primary with one of my stepsons and the general with the other. This is some of the best political moments of the past many years for me. But part of the reason that this is so profoundly inspirational and exciting is because Zohran Mamdani is one hell of a good politician. He's not just someone who's really smart and has good ideas and speaks well. He's a really good politician. And that's what we need. Anything else is just, what can I say, kind of playing around, you know? And my residual, probably somewhat embarrassed affection, if I can use that word, for Barack Obama. I mean, he did not do what we thought he was going to do. My friend Bill Fletcher Jr. said a few months after his election, he ran center left and is governing center right. And that's pretty much the epitaph. But a big part of why I suddenly, like a lot of us, my affection for Obama was that when he was running for president, he was such a good politician. He built an unbelievably effective machine, just like Mamdani did. You go get every vote. You don't leave any votes on the table. And that's what inspires me. That's what we need. We've come a long way, and thanks to Bernie. Of course, he said we need a political revolution. Well, that's what we're trying to do. We've got some good prospects despite the horrors happening all around us at the moment.
The last thing I wanted to ask you is something that I've been asking most of the folks who I've spoken with. Next year will be the 250th anniversary of the realization or the enactment of the Declaration of Independence. What do you think the significance is of this 250th anniversary, and how can people who want to realize, I'll say, the idea of universal and equal rights talk about this moment?
Reading this question before we got online like this, I thought to myself, it's amazing to me how little this is being discussed in any of the spaces that I inhabit, whether it's in HPAD, whether it's in these big donor groups that I sort of participate in, who are very progressive. When I think about it, like a good friend, someone I edited a book with, is David Waldstreicher. Frankly, you just don't get any better in early American history, cutting edge. David's a guy. His book, Slavery's Constitution, is short and sweet. I mean, it gets right down to it. He's just one of the top people. He advised the 1619. And I think about it. I talked to David about all kinds of things. I hope he doesn't mind me dropping his name. We don't talk about the 250th. It's weird. And I honestly don't know if it's because Trump's in power and therefore it seems like, how can we celebrate something while he's in power? What is he going to do? Put, gold leaf on the Declaration and try to sell it off, the original copies? Hey, I should be careful. What sounds like a joke, he might, right? And then, then I think, okay, well, what if back in 2013, this is going to make you laugh. I actually wrote, and I hope I never write another future projection again. After Obama winning twice and Clinton was sort of already set up as the, heir apparent, I thought, we're going to have a long future of social liberalism combined with center-right neoliberalism, like Obama time kind of, and then Clinton. I mean, I thought, oh, well, the way things are going, she'll win twice. Boy, was I wrong. But let's say we had someone, let's say Biden was remained a present person and therefore won re-election, okay? Then it would have been some anodyne, isn't it wonderful? Aren't we the great country? Isn't this a great democracy? It would have been better than Trump. Can you imagine Trump presiding, going to Philadelphia to celebrate or whatever? It either would have been an anodyne kind of everything is okay. I'm just projecting this if it was Biden, right? Or Harris. Or it would have been like the bicentennial. And I remember that quite well. It's all subjective. For me, the bicentennial, I was in New York. This is not something people talked about a lot. This is not a huge, there was, a parade of tall ships, and there was some, part of it is because it was 1976. We just got past Watergate and the end of the war. And, Ford had said within a few months, Gerald Ford, our long national nightmare is over. That was kind of the prevailing, yeah, oh boy, we don't have that nightmare again. I'm not being funny. I'm selling. So the bicentennial was kind of a ritual. For me, it's a non-starter. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I think that conceivably people, radical historians and left-wing people could do something with it. But nobody I know seems to, let's get down to it. People are mostly focused on the midterms. And actually, when I say focused on the midterms, focused on the question of whether we actually will have what passes for a free election in the U.S. And when I say passes, I mean with all of the voter suppression, the completely illegitimate purges. Let's just take a whole lot of people off without telling them. All of this stuff, okay? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, sending in ICE to guard polling sites, refusing to certify election results. I would say that I'm a lot more focused on that kind of thing. We need to get through, the second week in November with at least the apparatus still in place for free elections. I can see why you asked the question, but it's really actually quite striking how little attention there is to this. And it's not as if the Journal of American History and American Historical Review have been sending out special calls for things. Mm-hmm. I'm going to the American Historical Association business meeting in Chicago in January. I'm elected to its council as a kind of a dissident. And there's, I'm sure there will be something about 1776, but it's not a huge, big focus. What you're suggesting should be happening. I just had a steering committee of Historians for Peace and Democracy. This would be a group where people might say, we ought to be doing something about this, but we haven't because we've got our hands full with so much else,
Well, Van, thank you so much for coming on and talking about all of your work. It's been really interesting to learn about your background, all the thinking that's gone into your work, also touch on current events. I'll definitely make sure to link in the show notes your Substack, your work, and some of the other works that we've mentioned.
All right. Well, thanks, Luke.